A thick, oppressive silence hung in the air, broken only by the occasional creak of rusted metal. The hospital had been abandoned for decades, its walls stained with the memories of those who once sought solace within. The corridors stretched endlessly, each turn revealing more of the same decaying architecture. Dust particles floated lazily in the dim light that filtered through cracked windows. In the distance, the faint hum of a long-forgotten generator pulsed intermittently, as if the building itself still clung to life. Doors hung ajar, revealing rooms filled with discarded medical equipment and torn linens. A sense of dread permeated every corner, as if the very air was saturated with the fear of those who had never left. The once white walls were now a sickly yellow, peeling and cracked like the skin of a long-dead corpse. The floors were littered with broken glass and crumpled papers, remnants of a time when this place was alive. But now it was a tomb, a monument to the horrors that had taken place within. The silence was deafening, a void that seemed to swallow all sound. It was as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something or someone to disturb its long, restless slumber. Every step echoed loudly, the sound swallowed by the oppressive stillness. The air was thick with the smell of decay, a pungent reminder of the lives lost and forgotten. This was a place where time had stopped, where the past refused to die. And somewhere within its depths, something was waiting. As night fell, the hospital's atmosphere grew heavier, more oppressive. The darkness seemed to have a life of its own, wrapping around every corner, filling every shadow with malevolent intent. The wind howled through the broken windows, its eerie moans sounding like the distant cries of the lost. In the blackness, the walls seemed to close in, their presence almost tangible. And then, faintly at first, the whispers began. They were low, unintelligible murmurs, as if spoken by unseen lips in a language long forgotten. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, carried on the currents of the night. They spoke of pain, of suffering, of despair. It was impossible to tell if they were real or just the product of a mind fraying at the edges. The darkness grew thicker, pressing down like a weight, suffocating. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if begging to be heard. They seemed to come from within the very walls, from the depths of the building, as if the hospital itself was speaking. The air grew colder, the temperature plummeting as the night deepened. Breath fogged in the air, but the source of the chill was not the cold outside. It was something deeper, something far more terrifying. The whispers twisted and turned, weaving through the silence like a thread through fabric. They were inescapable, a constant presence, gnawing at the edges of sanity. And somewhere within the darkness, eyes watched, unseen and unblinking, waiting for the right moment to strike. The hospital was alive with the echoes of its past. Every room, every hallway seemed to reverberate with the lingering pain of those who had suffered within its walls. The building itself felt like a living organism, each creak and groan a reminder of the lives it had claimed. The echoes were more than just sounds. They were memories, imprints of moments filled with agony and despair. The rooms were filled with the residue of those moments. Beds with restraints still attached, surgical instruments scattered across tables as if abandoned mid-procedure, and faded medical charts detailing the final moments of countless patients. In one room, the sound of a faint heartbeat monitor could be heard, its steady beeping a cruel reminder of life slipping away. The walls seemed to pulse with a dull, rhythmic beat, as if the hospital itself had a heartbeat. The echoes grew louder in the night, merging with the whispers that filled the air. It was as if the hospital was trying to communicate, to tell the story of its suffering. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic, mixed with the underlying stench of decay. The floors were stained with dark patches, remnants of spilled blood that had never been cleaned. The building groaned under the weight of its own memories, the walls straining to contain the horror that had taken place within. The echoes were relentless, a constant reminder of the pain that had been inflicted here. And as they grew louder, it became clear that the hospital was not just a place, it was a prison, holding the souls of those who had never left. In the heart of the hospital, silence reigned supreme. It was a silence so profound that it seemed to have a presence of its own, pressing down on everything within the building. The air was thick with it, heavy and suffocating, as if the very act of breathing was an intrusion. There were no more whispers, no more echoes, just an all-encompassing silence that drowned out all other sound. The silence was unnatural, oppressive, as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting. The rooms, once filled with the sounds of life and death, were now tomes of absolute stillness. The only sound was the steady, pounding heartbeat in the ears, growing louder with each passing moment. It was as if the silence was amplifying the fear feeding on it. The walls seemed closer, the darkness more impenetrable. The hospital was a void, a place where sound was swallowed and lost, never to return. It was a silence that screamed, that clawed at the edges of sanity, threatening to pull everything into its dark, empty maw. The silence was not just the absence of sound, it was a presence, a force that filled every crevice, every corner, smothering all in its path. It was the silence of death, of a place where life had long since fled. And within that silence, something waited. It was a silence that demanded attention, that beckoned the unwary to listen, to give in to the darkness. But the silence was not empty. It was filled with the weight of countless souls, trapped in the hospital's walls, their suffering muted but ever present. And somewhere, deep within the heart of the building, something stirred, feeding on the silence, growing stronger with each passing moment. The shadows in the hospital were not natural. They twisted and writhed, as if alive, moving with a will of their own. At first, they were subtle, just a flicker at the edge of vision, a momentary distortion in the darkness. But as time passed, their movements became more pronounced, more deliberate. They stretched across the walls, pooling in the corners, shifting in ways that defied explanation. It was impossible to tell where the shadows ended and the darkness began. They were one and the same, a living entity that inhabited the hospital. The shadows danced and swayed, creating shapes that seemed almost human, but twisted, grotesque. They moved with purpose, creeping closer with each passing moment. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping as the shadows gathered. It was as if the very light was being consumed, swallowed by the ever-growing darkness. The hospital's once sterile walls were now covered in a film of grime, the white paint peeling away to reveal the rot beneath. The shadows seemed to feed on this decay, growing stronger, more defined. They whispered as they moved, a low, guttural sound that echoed through the halls. It was a language of the damned, incomprehensible but filled with malice. The shadows stretched out like hands, reaching for anything living, anything warm. They were relentless, unstoppable, growing stronger with each passing moment. The hospital was no longer just a building, it was a living, breathing entity, and the shadows were its soul. They moved with a purpose, a hunger that could never be sated. And as they closed in, the realization dawned that there was no escape. The stench of decay permeated the hospital, thick and pungent. It clung to everything, saturating the air, making it almost impossible to breathe. It was the smell of death, of rot, of something long dead but never truly gone. The source of the stench was impossible to pinpoint. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The walls oozed with moisture, dark stains spreading like a disease across the once pristine surfaces. The floors were sticky, the soles of shoes pulling at the congealed mess that coated every inch of the hospital. The scent was overpowering, filling the lungs with every breath, making it impossible to think of anything else. It was as if the hospital itself was rotting from the inside out, its very structure decaying as the stench grew stronger. The air was thick with it, heavy and cloying, making every breath a struggle. The smell was not just of decay, but of something deeper, more malevolent. It was the scent of something ancient, something that had been festering for years, feeding on the pain and suffering that had taken place within these walls. The stench seemed to follow, growing stronger with each step, as if the hospital was trying to suffocate, to drown in its own filth. The floors were slick with moisture, the walls soft to the touch, as if they were slowly dissolving. The decay was everywhere, unstoppable, a force that could not be denied. The hospital was dying, but it would not go quietly. It would take everything with it, dragging everything into its decaying depths. The scent of decay was a warning, a sign that there was no escape from the fate that awaited within these walls. Deep within the hospital, there was a room that had been sealed off for years, forgotten by all who had once worked there. The door was heavy, reinforced with steel, and covered in layers of dust. It was as if the room had been deliberately hidden, kept secret from the world. The air around the door was colder, the stench of decay stronger. The door creaked open, revealing a room unlike any other in the hospital. It was smaller than expected, The walls lined with shelves filled with jars, each containing a small, unidentifiable object floating in murky liquid. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, undisturbed for decades. The room felt different, as if it existed outside of time, untouched by the decay that had consumed the rest of the hospital. The jars on the shelves were covered in grime, their contents obscured, but there was something unsettling about them. Each one seemed to pulse with a faint light, as if alive. The room was filled with an overwhelming sense of dread, as if something terrible had happened here, something that had been deliberately hidden away. The air was thick with the scent of formaldehyde, mixing with the stench of decay that seeped in from the outside. The walls were lined with faded photographs, their images distorted by time, but the faces they depicted were twisted in expressions of pain and terror. The room felt alive, as if it was watching, waiting for someone to discover its secrets. It was a place of nightmares, where the forgotten were remembered, where the dead were never truly laid to rest. The room was a tomb, a final resting place for the hospital's darkest secrets. And as the door creaked shut, it was clear that those secrets would never be allowed to escape. There was something in the hospital, something that had been there all along, lurking just out of sight. It was a presence that could be felt more than seen, a constant weight that pressed down on everything within the building. It moved silently, unseen, but its presence was undeniable. The air grew thicker with each passing moment, the shadows deeper, as if the very fabric of reality was being warped by the presence. It was impossible to tell where it was, but it was always there, watching, waiting. The hospital was its domain, and it would not tolerate intruders. The walls seemed to close in, the corridors narrowing, as if the building itself was trying to trap anyone inside. The presence grew stronger, more oppressive, its influence spreading like a dark cloud. The air was thick with a sense of impending doom, as if something terrible was about to happen. Every step felt heavy, as if the floor itself was trying to pull down, to hold in place. The presence was relentless, a constant reminder that there was no escape. It was a malevolent force, feeding on fear, growing stronger with each passing moment. The walls were stained with dark patches, the floors slick with moisture, as if the hospital was slowly dissolving into the darkness. The presence was everywhere, in the shadows, in the walls, in the very air. It was a predator, and the hospital was its hunting ground. There was no way to escape it, no way to hide. It was always there, waiting, watching, ready to strike. And as the presence grew stronger, it became clear that it was only a matter of time before it made its move. The hospital was filled with the sounds of the damned. They were faint at first, barely audible over the oppressive silence, but they grew louder with each passing moment. The cries were a mixture of pain, despair, and terror, a chorus of suffering that echoed through the halls. They came from everywhere and nowhere, impossible to pinpoint, as if the very walls were crying out. The cries were relentless, a constant reminder of the lives lost within the hospital's walls. They were the voices of the forgotten, the damned, those who had been left behind to suffer in silence. The air was thick with their pain, the walls vibrating with the force of their despair. The cries grew louder, more insistent, as if begging for release, for someone to end their suffering. The hospital was a prison, a place where the souls of the damned were trapped, unable to move on. The walls were covered in dark stains, the floors slick with moisture, as if the building itself was weeping for those it had claimed. The cries were deafening, drowning out all other sound, a cacophony of agony that threatened to drive mad. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the stench of death, as if the hospital was slowly rotting from the inside out. The cries were a reminder of the horrors that had taken place within these walls, of the lives that had been lost, the pain that had been inflicted. They were a warning, a sign that there was no escape from the fate that awaited. The hospital was a place of suffering, a place where the damned cried out for release, but none would come. And as the cries grew louder, it became clear that they would never stop, never fade, but would continue to echo through the halls for all eternity. The hospital had reached its breaking point. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, the air thick with the scent of decay and death. The presence that had been lurking in the shadows was now fully revealed, its form a twisted amalgamation of darkness and suffering. It was a creature born of the hospital's pain, a manifestation of the horrors that had taken place within its walls. The air crackled with energy, the temperature plummeting as the presence grew stronger. The hospital was alive, its walls closing in, its corridors twisting and turning in impossible ways. There was no escape, no way out. The presence was relentless, a force of pure malevolence that would not rest until it had claimed everything within the hospital's walls. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the stench overpowering, as if the building itself was rotting from the inside out. The shadows twisted and writhed, forming shapes that defied explanation, their movements erratic and unnatural. The presence was everywhere, in the walls, in the air, in the very foundation of the hospital. It was a force of nature, unstoppable, unrelenting, driven by a hunger that could never be sated. The walls began to close in, the corridors narrowing, as if the hospital was trying to crush everything within its walls. The presence grew stronger, more oppressive, its influence spreading like a dark cloud, suffocating everything in its path. The air was thick with a sense of impending doom, as if the hospital itself was preparing for the final confrontation. There was no escape, no way out. The presence was too strong, too powerful. And as the walls closed in, as the darkness consumed everything, it became clear that the hospital would not rest until it had claimed everything, until it had become a tomb for all who dared to enter. The final confrontation was at hand, and there would be no survivors. The ringing began just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, creeping shadows across the quiet house. At first, it seemed like any ordinary ring, a harmless sound that merely signaled the arrival of someone at the door. But tonight, the sound felt different, almost intrusive, breaking the comforting silence that had settled in the house. There was no one expected, no plans for visitors, and the parents wouldn't be back until much later. The child hesitated, eyes fixed on the door from across the room. The doorbell echoed again, more insistent this time. The chime seemed to reverberate through the walls, growing louder, filling the space with an eerie tension. Curiosity tugged at the child's thoughts, but fear anchored them to the spot. Should they answer it? What if it was just a prank or worse? The house, once a safe haven, now felt like a trap. Silence fell again, but it was no longer comforting. It was heavy, oppressive, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The child could hear the faint ticking of a clock somewhere in the distance, a reminder that time was still passing even as the world outside seemed to have paused. The doorbell hadn't rung in a while, but the unease hadn't faded. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows sent a shiver down their spine. The child tiptoed through the house, trying to stay as quiet as possible, ears straining to catch any sound that might indicate who or what had been at the door. But all they could hear was the sound of their own breathing, quick and shallow. They reached the front door, their hand hovering over the doorknob, unsure whether to open it or not. What if something was waiting on the other side? As the child stood frozen in place, something caught their eye, a shadow that didn't belong. It flickered in the corner of their vision, just at the edge of the hallway, where the light from the street lamp outside barely reached. At first, they thought it was just their imagination playing tricks, but then it moved, slow and deliberate, creeping along the wall. Panic surged through them, heart pounding in their chest as they backed away from the door. The shadow seemed to stretch, growing larger as it approached, until it loomed over them, dark and menacing. The child's breath hitched, their mind racing to make sense of what was happening. Was someone, or something, inside the house with them? They stumbled back, nearly tripping over their own feet as they fled toward the living room, desperate to put some distance between them and the shadowy figure. But no matter where they went, the sense of being watched never left them. It wasn't long before the whispers started. Soft at first, barely audible over the sound of their own heartbeat, but they grew louder with each passing moment. The voice was strange, distorted, as if it were coming from a place that wasn't quite real. It called out, beckoning the child to come closer, to step into the darkness where the shadow had vanished. The child clamped their hands over their ears, trying to block out the voice, but it was no use. It seemed to seep into their mind, twisting their thoughts, making it impossible to think clearly. They wanted to run to hide, to escape whatever was lurking in the house, but the voice was everywhere, surrounding them, pressing in on all sides. It whispered promises, threats, and something else, something they couldn't quite understand, but it filled them with dread all the same. With trembling hands, the child tried to lock the doors, to shut out whatever was out there. But no matter how many locks they turned, how many windows they checked, the sense of impending doom only grew stronger. The house no longer felt like a place of safety. It was a prison, and the darkness outside was closing in. They could hear footsteps now, slow and deliberate, moving up the stairs across the hall. The door to their room creaked open, and the child's heart leaped into their throat. They scrambled to hide, crawling under the bed, behind the curtains, anywhere they thought might keep them out of sight. But the footsteps didn't stop. They paused outside the room, then continued on, as if searching for something or someone. The doorbell rang one last time, a long, drawn-out chime that echoed through the empty house like a death knell. The child was trapped, nowhere left to run, nowhere left to hide. They could feel the presence getting closer, the air around them growing colder with each passing second. The whispers were louder now, clearer, and the child could finally make out the words. "Come to me," it said, over and over, until it was all they could hear. The child squeezed their eyes shut, wishing it would all just go away, but the darkness was all-consuming, swallowing them whole. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The house was silent again, the oppressive atmosphere lifted. But the child knew better. Whatever had come to the door, whatever had whispered to them in the dark, it wasn't gone. It was waiting, and it would return.